Hello, this is the presentation for Hugh McManus, who's unfortunately not able to attend today. I am off overseas in Switzerland, and it turns out that due to the schedule change tomorrow, I can't stay up late tonight. I have to be up bright and early in the morning and ready to go. So I'm going to try something new, which is to record the presentation on the PowerPoint and see if that works, and let's hope that it does. So the talk this evening is going to be about the company I picked, which is CSCO Systems, and the analysis of CSCO Systems really involves looking at inventory, accounts receivable, and revenues to see if something can be said about what's happening in the future, and particularly if something can be said about what's happening about the numbers that we're seeing today. Now, the fact is that companies don't know the future, but they're really compelled to make guesses about what's going to happen. To that end, they have to buy inventory in advance and assemble those into finished products. It's not a big issue for service companies, which by definition don't have inventories, but for companies that make tangible items, physical items, they really need to have inventory. And in fact, details of this inventory is provided not only in the annual and quarterly reports, but even more detail is provided in the 10K and 10Qs, which the companies file with the SEC and which are available online. And there's an accompanying PDF document that I presented that has more information on where to go and look for these. So companies build today to sell tomorrow, and if they build too much, they have bloated inventories. They stop manufacturing, or at least they stop buying other products. They manufacture from inventory, and they sell from the finished goods. This actually in the past has led to recessions. But they have to take risks and make guesses, and those are things from which we can learn. Now, the three areas that I'm going to look at for CSCO, and this is applicable to any company that is inventory intensive, are revenues, accounts receivable, and inventories. And inventories, if it's material, can be broken into 3 or more areas. In fact, if you look at home building companies, it's often broken into 5, 6, or even 7 areas. But for companies such as CSCO, it's broken into raw materials or raw goods. These are things that are bought from other vendors. Work in progress, that's the conversion of raw materials into something that's beginning to look like an end product. Once it's a work in progress, it's not easily convertible back into a raw material. It's committed to go forward to an end product. And finally, finished goods. And these 3 components are given different names, these 3 components of inventory. But generally, they are often called raw goods, work in progress, and finished goods. And by the way, raw goods and work in progress, or WIP, those 2 components are often aggregated in some companies if these components themselves aren't that material. The other issue is, of course, that companies run on credit. Payment is often postponed for 30, or in some cases, if you're a big pharma company, 45 or 60 days to preserve cash. And so even though goods, the loss or the risk of loss has been transferred, cash has not. And so monitoring accounts receivable tell you something about what is going on with the company's credit policy and what's going on with its customers. And it's often expressed as a ratio, a turnover rate, which is receivables divided into sales. And obviously a smaller receivables number means a higher turnover, which is good, all else being equal. Generally, higher, as I said, is better, but, it could mean that the company has very strict credit terms. It's turning away potential business for those that can only manage a 30-day payment term. Low generally can be a bad thing. It means credit policy is probably too lax, or perhaps even customers have probably difficulty in paying. But the thing to look at is changes in this accounts receivable turnover rate. And then we look at inventories. As I said, they're goods that are ready for sale if they're a finished good. We mainly find them in manufacturing companies. By definition, the service sector really doesn't have inventories. And inventory appears as an asset on the balance sheet. And not only do you find this information on the annual report or quarterly reports that the companies issue to their shareholders, but you also find significantly more detailed information in the 10Ks and the 10Qs. And it's well worth looking at these. It's particularly for specialty chemical companies or any company that's in the home building industry. You really can start to see signs of issues well in advance, and I'll touch on those in a minute. But a rule of thumb is that all else being equal, sales and inventory should grow in tandem. And by the way, sales and account receivables should grow in tandem too. I described work in progress earlier. I'll just touch on it here, but it's basically a product that is not yet a finished good. It cannot easily be converted back into a raw material, so it's committed to going through to final product. But it can also be called things like semi-finished or partially finished or in process, names like that. It actually could be, for all intents and purposes, a final product. It just might be the case that quality control hasn't released it, hasn't signed off on it, or final testing hasn't been completed. But it's not ready for sale for whatever reason. And then a finished product is something that is ready for sale, ready to go off to the customer, it's warehoused. And as we'll see later on when we look at CSCO in some more detail, CSCO even breaks its inventory down further today. It used to be in 4 components actually, not only raw materials, work in progress, and finished goods, but they also looked at demo units as well. And now they break it up into warehoused products and products that have been sent off to their distributors. So there's even more detail there. We look at the results for 2000, we see some interesting things. I'm going to present this table over and over again, so we'll look at, over on the left, January of 2000, January 26th, we'll look at that in some detail. The first figure you see is 4350, that's a sales number. We can see that it is an increase of 53.9% from the same quarter in 1999. Remember, back in the heydays of the internet, this was particularly common to see companies that were making the bricks and mortar. Those that supplied the picks and shovels were doing extremely well and saw really dramatic sales growth. The next number is accounts receivables. These are payments due to the company for products that have been shipped and that are actually being held by the customers at this point in time. That only grew by 15.8%. Normally, I said earlier it should grow in tandem with sales, but back in these days, companies like CSCO really dominated the field and could dictate terms to their potential customers. So it didn't grow as fast as sales. Inventories grew at 47.2%, right in line with the sales growth. And you can run through inventories, and this came from the 10Q. You can see raw materials grew at 23%, work in progress at 33.5%, and finished goods grew a little bit faster than sales at 66.7%. That other figure we're not going to worry about, but I present it here and continue to present it because it is included in the 10Qs. It's not really that material. But the fact is that for each of these numbers for each year, we're looking at the comparable figure from the pre-quarter in the previous year. So moving from left to right, you see in April, sales still continue to grow at 50+%. Accounts receivable jumped dramatically to 50%. And we can see that raw materials seem to grow at a nice steady clip. And as we move from left to right, by October of 2000, there were clear signs of trouble. Now, sales continued to grow nicely. The sales growth was actually increasing and had reached 68%. But when you look at accounts receivable and compare it to the figure that it was back in January, 15.8%, we now see that by the end of the year, accounts receivable was growing at over 100% compared to October of 1999. That's a huge red flag. And when we look also at inventory, we see that inventory figures were just skyrocketing. Inventory was growing at a rate of almost 200% compared to 1999. And going through in more detail, we see there was a backlog of raw materials. Work in progress was piling up at a rate of 136%. Finished goods was growing at 133%. It was growing faster and consistently faster across the board than sales. A huge, huge warning sign that it was time to say goodbye to CSCO, at least temporarily, because there were going to be earnings problems in the future. And if we skip forward to 2001, this became apparent. The eye is immediately drawn over to the far right, where the financials are bleeding profusely. You can see those red figures in the very last column, which shows what happened 12 months into the future in October. But let's move over to the left and look at January 1st, and you see that this incredible growth in receivables and inventories continued. Obviously, the company was going to have to do something dramatic with raw materials, cancel contracts with vendors, change the terms, do something, but it was going to have to cut back dramatically here. But these signals were very clearly validated. And if you recall, the inventory was written off towards the end of this year, $1 billion, which was dramatic in those days. But revenues and earnings were starting to take a hit by April of 2008, which is actually the fiscal fourth quarter for Cisco. It's a little bit awkward because they report their financial results for the year in the end of July. But the predictive signals that were seen in the receivables, sales, and inventories in 2000 were just very sadly, if you will, and dramatically validated the following year. And then if we fast forward to 2006, this is a good example because, again, there are issues here, there are signals, but there's nothing really that stands out. There's no corroborating signal from two pieces of financial information which would kind of cause you to move and do something dramatic. But there are concerns here. The first thing that's a good sign is that sales are growing. Sales are growing year over year. Quarter over quarter compared to the 12-month period in 2005, the year ago period. Receivables are growing at a nice clip as well, and they are starting to grow faster than sales, and that's a little bit of a concern. It's a little bit of the proverbial heartburn that gives you a bit of a warning sign. But inventories seem well in control. They're not growing faster than sales at all. They will have to increase and catch up. But there's nothing in inventories that jumps out and says, you know, you need to start paying attention here. It's by the fourth quarter, which is actually the fiscal first quarter for Cisco in October of 2006, that red flags start to appear. I mean, sales are growing at almost 25%, whereas receivables are now growing at 32%. That's actually a decline from the previous quarter. Inventories? Well, inventories aren't doing so badly, but finished goods have jumped up to 20%. So there's a little bit of a red flag here, and something just to watch. By 2007, of course, things seem to be improving for accounts receivable. If you just skip across from left to right, you see in the January quarter, AR was 14.6%, and it declined to 8.7% by April, and had increased in July to 20.8%, but it was tracking sales. Sales growth was 18.1% for that quarter, so it seemed it looked fine. And inventories, well, inventories actually seem to be improving. If anything, if you look over on the far right for the October figure, total aggregate inventories have dropped by 11% compared to October for 2006. So management seemed to be doing something correctly here. Now, some of the inventory, if you look down, was being pushed into distributors, but nothing really huge here. There just is general unease here about the behavior of inventories. There's no consistent story that you can see from period to period. But inventories are starting to outpace sales. It's a bit of a concern, but again, it's one of these red flags, one of these tiny little items of heartburn that doesn't really constitute something on which you should act. And then by the following year, 2008, that's when things started to turn pretty dramatically. In fact, in the very first quarter of the year, which is the fiscal third quarter for Cisco, January 26, 2008, sales were again growing at 16.5%, but inventories were starting to pile up dramatically, and accounts receivable appeared to be out of control. There were a couple of red flags here, and because there are two or more signals that are showing problems, I would have taken this as an action item for Cisco. And of course, as you move forward into the year, and we recall those horrible bleak days in the summer and in the fall when the world seemed to be falling apart, things were not looking good for Cisco either. Sales for the year were declining every single quarter compared to the quarter in the previous year. Receivables were declining too, but that's all else been equal a good point. But if you recall back in these periods, credit was no longer available for many customers, so perhaps this was something almost foisted upon the company. You can see their inventory levels were dropping as well. By 2009, of course, the situation looked horrible. And if you ever need an example of what a proverbial 1930s downturn looks like in a modern economy, have a look at this chart here. Everything looks just horrible. The company, of course, all else, facts are that it's getting its inventory under control in a very dramatic and painful way, but its sales are really collapsing. But by 2010, the bleeding seemed to have stopped, and it seemed to stop in the very first quarter calendar year 2010, which is the third quarter for Cisco. You can see sales were now on the upswing, 8% growth compared to the January quarter of 2009. We can see that raw materials started to stack up dramatically, which is a sign perhaps that the company sees something good on the horizon. Receivables was a concern. You can see that for January and for May, these numbers are huge. Now, back when I noticed this growth, I just put this down to the fact that the world had gone crazy and companies weren't getting credit anymore. So they were trying to invent credit where they could. And when you see a receivables number like this, it could be explained by the fact that the customers unilaterally were increasing their credit terms and saying, hey, we're not going to pay you in 30 days, we're going to pay you in 60, but we are going to pay you. But sales were growing, so that was a good sign. Receivables was out of whack. And by the way, if you look back to Cisco in the late 90s, I think 96, if you look back in the mid-2000s, 2004 and 2005, you saw something similar to this happening there, and it wasn't a fatal. It is a sign, but it's not a fatal sign just yet, because inventories are growing at the same rate as sales, and there's nothing really pointing out that there's really problems just from these two quarters. As you move into the July quarter, we're seeing the same behavior. Its receivables has decreased slightly. Sales is still on the uptick. Inventories are growing, slower than sales, but they're growing at a nice steady clip. But I think by the fourth quarter of the year, this is the first quarter in Cisco's new fiscal year, the 2011 fiscal year, that's when you saw problems. Now, sales had declined for the first quarter, October 30th, 2010. Receivables were higher than sales as they had been for the year, but the troubling thing here was there was now another corroborating signal, and that is a growth in inventories. Inventories now were dramatically outpacing sales by a factor of 2 to 1, and when you look at that figure in concert with what's happening in receivables, that's when you start to get a warning sign. And of course you look at the breakdown as to what's happening, and you see once again that, yeah, well, it looks like the distributors' material has been pushed through the distribution channel again, but work in progress is piling up, as is raws. And actually, in the accompanying PDF document, you can see that this trend continues for the first quarter of 2011, which is the second quarter of Cisco's fiscal year. This activity increases too. And I think this is the very last slide, but I do want to say that analyzing inventories, and especially the components of inventory, in concert with accounts receivable and with sales, is a really powerful way for predicting the future in manufacturing companies. And it's something that I would at least encourage people to consider doing, particularly if you're an investment club. You can assign somebody to do it just to see, and I think you'll be surprised by the results.